You guys can see this, right? Okay, so this is I just thought this is like an initial image. There's nothing to do with my talk, but this is from a kind of a manual produced around 1300 in the city of Mardin, which is today in southeast Turkey. And it's this book of some guy who's wrote a book about kind of engineering marvels. And this is actually automatic wine pouring machine, which, he was designing for some sultan who wanted to make it. And what it is it's a closet, and every 8 times an hour, this paper mache slave woman would come out, Jadia would come out and give you like a glass of wine. I thought that's interesting just because you can imagine this is what somebody is trying to make a paper mache version of a elite palace slave woman in the 13th century in northern Syria. And this is the picture that they would paint, which I thought was interesting to think about. Okay, so I was going to talk about like two topics which I found interesting, and I think, as I said, there's a lot of potential, I think, to study for people interested in the kind of intersection of race and slavery in Islamic civilization. And one is this idea of, and I know Khalid Sesa has written about this in an article. He and I talked about it before about slave saints, or saints who are slaves, right? And this has there's, I think, fertile ground to study this in modern Western Northwest Africa, probably maybe elsewhere as well. But there's also a lot to look for in the pre-modern Islamic tradition. And so one of the things that got me onto this was actually this book here, which I can use a prop because I'm like, I see this small book. This is a book. It's called Hilyat al-Awliya, The Ornament of Saints, by a scholar from Isfahan named Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, who died in 1038 of the Common Era, a big hadith scholar and kind of Sufi devotee. And it's basically just massive biography of saints. And toward the end, in the last volume, in a kind of unmarked section, he discusses these these saints, he says, that whose names have generally not been preserved in history, but it's because of their piety that the world remains secure. So it's almost a seed of this idea you see developing a little bit later on, becoming very prominent in Islamic history, about the idea of like the inner caliphate, that there's the kind of the outward temporal rulers, but they're not really the rulers of the world, that the real rulers of the world, the real holders of the caliphate, are the saints. And that this is an interesting idea about saying that these are actually the section is devoted almost entirely to either Black African saints or slave saints, or both, right? Which is very interesting. And the section is worthy of study. It's just so rich with lots of different stories in it. Everything from, a guy who's talking about how he's wandering through like Egypt in the 900s and he comes across this woman. Actually, no, he's actually goes to East Africa, to kind of the land of what they would call the Zanj. And he sees this woman kind of singing poetry in, he says, like Zanj language, and he's just like so impressed with her. He thinks she's basically some kind of saint. So you have all these like fascinating vignettes. And one story that really caught my mind, and I actually translated this story in the appendix of my book, Slavery in Islam, is a story of this slave saint in Basra in the 700s, who the city's going through a drought, and all the scholars and Sufis and the pious leaders of the city are out praying for rain, and nothing works. And then this one very pious, respected scholar called Malik bin Dinar sees this one, he calls him like kind of black Ethiopian guy with skinny legs, and he's sort of a short and has a pot belly. And he sees him just do this very quiet, private prayer to God. And then the second he finishes, the rain just starts pouring down, right? So he realizes this guy is the real saint of the city. And he sort of follows him, finds out he's a slave who's being held in this kind of a slave entrepot by a slave dealer. And he goes with his friends and they buy him the next day. And the slave's kind of confused about why you're buying me. He says, no, we buy you because we want to serve you. We want you to teach us. And drama ensues, a kind of pietistic story. And in the end, the very quickly, the the guy dies, the saint dies while he's praying, um, and they turn his body over, and then they see that the blackness had disappeared from his face, and his face was like the moon. So this was a very interesting story because although you have this like subversion of social hierarchy, you still have the kind of idea that blackness if face is something that is disappears as someone as their piety is revealed. But it's interesting, and I want you to think about this idea of like his face becoming like the moon, because it doesn't say his face became white or something. It says his face became like the moon, which is an interesting concept. So there was, I found also in another book by a scholar called Ibn al-Jawzi. You all may know Ibn al-Jawzi because he died in 1201 of the Common Era. He wrote a book on the virtues of the blacks and Ethiopians, Tanwir al-Ghabash, in which it's probably the most it's the most comprehensive of these books on the virtues of kind of Africans and Ethiopians. So it's been translated into English as well. And he actually includes that same story that I just mentioned, but interestingly cuts off the last line about his face, the blackness disappearing and his face becoming like the moon. Although he gets the story from this book, he actually somehow that line gets removed. Okay, so he has a number of stories as well that are actually very similar, and these are just for those of you who are interested in reading it, but basically of early Muslim scholars and saints in the 700s and 800s who go in a variety of circumstances. They're in Mecca or they're in Medina, and they come across, there's a drought, no one can get the rain to fall, and then some black slave comes out and prays privately, and then then the rain starts coming, and then they realize that this person's like the real saint, and they're sort of like, then they kind of go and try to study with them. So this actually apparently became like a trope. I mean, maybe these events actually happened, or it becomes like a literary trope. It's sort of unclear, but it's very interesting. And I think a lot of potential to study this. Of course, a really famous instance of this is actually in the Masnavi of the famous Jalaluddin Rumi, who died in 1273. And this is actually a translation by Arbery into English. You can see this story of this kind of black slave who goes out and he's on a caravan. He goes out into the desert. He encounters kind of basically a manifestation of the Prophet Muhammad. And it says, I just have here that the Negro placed the hands of the Prophet on his face, showering them with loves and kisses. And the Prophet rubbed his blessed hand on the Negro's cheek, imparting to it his blessing. That Ethiopian Negro became white as the full moon. His night turned to bright day. So again, you have this idea of blackness disappearing as the person as their piety and their attainment of sainthood in a way is manifested. But again, you have this idea of it not becoming white or like Caucasian or something, but actually becoming like the moon. And I think it's important to discuss why that is. For a number of reasons. I think that the moon is associated with the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad is often kind of personified as the moon, the beauty of the moon. His face is like the moon. The second reason is that, and this I think gets into kind of Sufi cosmology and Islamic philosophy, is which has its origins in kind of essentially kind of Near Eastern Neoplatonism, where the moon is the lowest level of the heavenly sphere. So we live in the sublunary realm. The moon is like the kind of liminal body that is the last body of the unchanging realm of the spheres before you get into the kind of world. Sorry, there's a fly in my face. The world of corruption and change that we live in. So the idea of kind of transcending, going from this earthly life to moving up towards an attainment of closeness to God and kind of annihilation in God and unity with God and things like that is here kind of metaphorically described as becoming like the moon. And then if you think about the personalities you're dealing with in these stories, right, they're the kind of lowest of the low. They're the earthy, dark colored slave, dark like Adam, like the original human being. Adam in Arabic probably means originally dark colored or black. And so you go from kind of a human lowliness to transcendence in that imagery. So I think that's an important reason why you have this description of the moon. It's not just like the blackness disappears, but you do have some instances where it doesn't talk about the moon, but I think are very interesting as well. This again is also from Hilyat al-Awliya of Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani, and I think it's in the biography of Dhu al-Nun al-Misri, who's a very interesting saint. He dies in 861 of the Common Era. You can see here, I just highlighted it. So Dhu an-Nun al-Misri, his dad is actually Nubian. So he himself is sort of like sometimes talked about as being black, as being African. But it's not I mean, but other times he's not described as such, but he without a doubt has this link to Nubia. And you have this very interesting story where Abu Nu'aym al-Isfahani has this report that Dun al Misri said to us, basically, I was like out in the kind of wasteland and I saw a black person. And every time he mentioned the name of God, his color turned white. Abiyadda, launuhu. Every time he mentioned God, his color turned white. Um, so that's like a very interesting story. You can almost have like a instantaneous effect of this piety sainthood demonstrating itself. So I think, again, I didn't want to, I mentioned, I think some of these stories in my book, Islam and Blackness, but I think that there's a huge amount of material that can be worked on as like a literary, as like a subgenre of saints biographies. And again, I'm happy to help anybody who's interested in pursuing this. The second thing I want to talk about, which is a very short thing, but I think also has a lot of potential, is the notion of smell and sense associated with slavery and with especially blackness or Black African kind of racialization as Black African. I think Andrew Kettle had a book called The Smell of Slavery, which came out maybe a few years ago, kind of looking at kind of 18th and 19th century, the way that kind of sense of smell and stuff became associated with racial backgrounds and slavery in the kind of Atlantic world. So I think there's potentially a lot or there's certainly some material to find and work on in this is pre-modern Islamic tradition, and almost certainly also in the early modern Islamic tradition as well. But this is an alleged hadith. I mean, it's attribution to the Prophet Muhammad. I don't think it's authentic. It appears for the first time at first and pretty much only time in this collection of Al-Hakam an-Naysaburi, who is a scholar from Khorasan who dies in 1014 of the Common Era. And so it's actually very unusual to have a hadith appear only that late. It's usually considered a sign of forgery, at least among most Muslim scholars. And this is a story, I'll just read to you. A black man came to the Prophet and said, O messenger of God, indeed I am a black man, putrid smelling, muntin rih, with an ugly face and no money. If I were to fight against these folks, these kind of enemies of Islam, until I were killed, where would I be? He replied, in the garden. So the man fought until he was slain. The Prophet ﷺ went up to his body and said, God has whitened bayadha, your face, sweetened your smell, and given you great wealth. And he said to him and to others, I have seen his wife among the dark-eyed beauties. Probably black is not a good term to throw in here because it just confuses things. But dark-eyed heavenly beauties, who are, by the way, in the way they're described in kind of hadith reports and other reports, exegetical reports, very white colored. So they're actually like their skin is so white that it's almost translucent. But so his wife is one of these dark-eyed beauties, taking off his woolen cloak and sliding her body between the cloak and his body. So you see this story of I think it's interesting to maybe pursue this idea of like putrid smell being associated not necessarily with slaves, because this guy is not a slave. We have no evidence that he is, but the idea of kind of smells being associated with people who are racialized as Black African. So I think that's something that also can be pursued. I don't want to take more time because I don't really have any lot more to say anyway. But these were just two subjects I thought were potentially useful if people wanted to continue looking into them. Thanks very much.